What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and Carnage is about to massacre a whole bunch of gods. Now, this picks up in what's called Omnipotent City, and much like what you saw in Thor: Love and Thunder, Omnipotent City is a place where all gods across the entirety of the universe can all come together, either to hold a kind of congress where they all meet in times of crisis, or to like study books and different things like that, because all the books that are here basically detail the histories of all gods that have ever existed across the universe. Now, the question has to be asked, how in the world did Carnage get powerful enough to kill all these gods? Well, if you guys haven't been following, and we'll have a link to the Carnage playlist at the end of this video, Carnage had basically started traveling the multiverse after separating from his host, Cletus Cassidy, for the purpose of just amassing huge levels of power and seemingly trying to find a way to become the new King in Black, the new kind of god of the universe, so to speak. And then in turn, basically wipe out all life, right? As basic as it is, the story was anything but. The story was phenomenal. Like, Carnage's run over the course of the last 2 to 3 years has been amazing. But that's why he's so powerful, because he has none of the weaknesses of any of the symbiotes and all of the strengths of the symbiotes, and then even more on top of that. And that's why he's able to hold his own against these gods, specifically against the Lord Librarian. And the reason why is because the Lord Librarian is the guy who oversees Omnipotent City, right? Literally a librarian dealing with these just gigantic library. But do not let that fool you, right? This staff that he holds, at the tip of it, that little ball that he has, it's literally a black hole. It has the ability to send people through space and time. But what's really crazy here is that the Carnage symbiote, operating on its own, again, separated from its host Cletus Cassidy, has always just kind of been going under this idea that it just wants to amass power. And so in this conversation with the Lord Librarian, he literally says, "You came here to learn if you are a god." And the response of Carnage is, "I know what I am. I have conquered every weakness of the symbiote. I have the powers of a god, the immortality of a god. I have made myself what I am." And the response of the Lord Librarian here is, "And you come to us for answers that you already have, asking all the wrong questions." And he says, if you are a god, who prays to you? Who worships you? What is your doctrine? What were you created to do? Now, this is an incredibly important thing, because what this does is it initiates this gigantic paradigm shift in Carnage, because he's no longer on this warpath of literally just trying to wipe out all of creation. He's achieved the power of a god. But with this question that was posed by the Lord Librarian, what he realizes is he has all the power, but he doesn't have the role. And so to truly become a god, he needs people to worship him. But it can't be one of these things where it's like the cult of Carnage, which is just some crazy guys in cloaks who were probably ultra rich and who just want to bring him back or something like that. He needs people to genuinely believe in him. But once the Lord Librarian realizes what it is that he's done, at least seemingly comes to this realization, he literally just ends up snatching up Carnage using his staff, right? Plunges it into his chest, and Carnage is ripped through space and time and basically sent back at some point in his early days. Now, the cool thing about this is that when that happens, right, he literally transitions to Rikers Island, and we're told this is where it all began. There was adrenaline in the air then too, sweet and irresistible. Now, one thing that I also want to point out here is that sending Carnage back through space and time, it's really him just kind of being sent back to Earth is really what it is. It's not as though he's being sent back to the very early days of his existence. Instead, what goes on here is that in this moment when he kills this inmate, he basically spits out Cletus Cassidy. Now, that's one of the things that I want to specify here, right? Because this can be a little confusing if you're following the Carnage mythos, and especially if you're not. In Marvel Comics, following the King in Black event, Null, the symbiote god, and all that kind of stuff, the Carnage symbiote separated itself from Cletus, and then Cletus in turn became his own guy. So there is a Cletus Cassidy out there in Marvel Comics right now, and you could call him the true Cletus Cassidy, right? The real Cletus. This version of Cletus that you see here is really more of a memory memory given physical form by Carnage. That's really what this is, but it allows Carnage to kind of operate and to better understand humans. At least that seems to be the case, because even then it's a little clandestine, because all we get here is we get the statement, it takes him a moment, but Cletus Cassidy is not easily flustered. He takes in the last decade, the memories seep into his mind, memories belonging to another Cletus of another time. Trusting this other, Carnage holds nothing back. So basically he takes all the knowledge of everything that's happened and dumps it into Cletus Cassidy himself. And so what this does is, for a moment, it switches over to Flash Thompson. And Flash Thompson, for those of you guys who don't really know, he has, at least probably over the course of the last, I don't know, decade and a half, had a lot more involvement with the symbiote than at any time before, especially when he became Agent Venom, which was really, really cool. But ever since then, he's really taken on the role of what's called anti-venom. So in effect, he's like a venom symbiote that can cure other people of illnesses. That's a relatively new development in Marvel Comics. It happened during King in Black, but he has a kind of tie to Carnage, right? Insofar as he can, quote unquote, sense his presence, or at least be able to detect some kind of changing in the winds, right? Metaphorically speaking, when it comes to the symbiotes. All this is designed to simply say, Carnage, with the level of power he has now, masquerading as Cletus Cassidy with a whole new set of intentions, shifts and changes the game entirely. Because as Cletus Cassidy is making his way, right, just through the world as a whole, he's reading up on social media. He's kind of catching up on everything that's happened, because it's one of these weird and wonky things where it seems to be a kind of memory of Cletus that hasn't been around for a long time and doesn't really know everything that's happening. I know it's a little wonky, it's a little weird. I'm sure it'll become clearer as time goes on. But the important thing here is he ends up making his way into a diner. And this girl named Sarah literally just kind of like serves him. And as the two of them start talking, it's one of these things where we kind of get this sort of monologue, right? Where it says, in his hunger, Carnage finds the thing he's missed the most, the need, quote unquote. It is human desires to live, to act, to mate, to kill. Right? His purpose overtakes the symbiotes. It is beyond a bond. Carnage and Cletus consume each other. They are one. And so what's cool is it's really kind of the human side of Carnage sort of taking over, right? Like almost like Carnage is sort of reintroducing himself or beginning to understand what it means to be a human in the world. And so you have this conversation between himself and Sarah, where Sarah walks over and she asks, like, what are you reading? And his response is the Bible, right? And she's just like, oh, I'm sorry, and he's like, why are you sorry, right? They're just words. Not a God-fearing woman then. And he kind of comments and he says, I always found that to be a curious expression, God-fearing. Why fear your absent, indifferent God? Now, this is one of the things that I want to point out here, right? From Sarah's perspective, the concept of God is most likely Judeo-Christian, since this is taking place in the United States, and Judeo-Christianity is like the dominant religion here in the States. Basically, from her perspective, God is just a being who exists out there somewhere beyond the realm of human understanding and has had like avatars that have appeared on earth to basically communicate his message, right? Jesus as his son, if you believe in that, Moses, the whole nine yards. For someone like Cletus Cassidy, and for us as the comic book reader, we know none of that is true. We know there is no God of Abraham. I guess the closest you could get to that is the one above all, but there are a mountain of gods in between, right? There's just all kinds of beings that exist out there. And so it's one of the reasons why Cletus doesn't really take the conversation about the concept of God seriously, because he basically knows the reality of how the various gods exist out there in the world. And so when he asks her, like, what are you listening to? She's like, oh, it's just a true crime podcast, because for reasons beyond our ability to understand, women relax when it comes to just stories about people being murdered, right? Like, in all seriousness, right? I mean, like, she just listened to a true crime thing. And so when she says, I'll turn it off, he's like, no, that's really interesting. It's cool. Like, why do you listen to it? And her response is, it's fascinating, I suppose, right? It makes me feel prepared, something about knowing what truly goes on out there. Now, that's an important statement for her to make, because what it does is it communicates to Cletus Cassidy that people on some level have a kind of sixth sense. Now, the reason why this whole kind of Cletus Cassidy thing is important is because even with Cletus Cassidy as a character in Marvel Comics prior to any of this, right? Like its origin story, the original like Maximum Carnage story from back in the 90s and so on and so forth, he was always a kind of psychopath, disconnected from what it meant to be a human being. So he didn't really see or function the way a human traditionally would. And he certainly didn't experience fear in things like that the way people would. He was almost kind of like an inhuman being walking around human beings. And so because of that, it is in a lot of ways kind of learning. Now, Cletus Kasady is the avatar, right? Like it really is just kind of like Carnage that's experiencing all of this. But it's Carnage slowly and steadily learning with this kind of sixth sense. Human beings, whether through evolution or learned behavior, whatever it happens to be, are always kind of like on the lookout for this idea that one, there's something greater than themselves, and two, that it may manifest in some kind of a form, i.e. human beings are primed to believe in a God. And so all he has to do is engineer a set of circumstances that will lead them to believe that. And that's what's so important here, because even when he leaves, right, like we're literally told, he feels the weight of godliness on his shoulders, but he finds he is equal to it. As the hours pass, a plan forms, a doctrine. It feels right. This world feels ready for carnage. Now, the reason why this is so important here is because in years past, when it came to the Carnage symbiote, he would just like roll into a diner with like 30 people in it and just massacre them all. And that would be it, right? He would write like Carnage Rules in Blood or like Maximum Carnage or something along those lines. But in a lot of ways, the public perception of Carnage was rooted more in fear in relation to like Venom, or like the Green Goblin, or Red Skull, or Magneto, depending on what he's doing. But it was really just more like, man, I hope that guy doesn't attack me. But they didn't really see him as some kind of godlike being. They just saw him as like a dude over there who does some stuff. And so by embracing this kind of godly concept, what he can do is start to mold societal perception of him away from this idea that like Carnage is a guy who's violent and tears things up, and almost see him as this kind of immutable, indestructible force that exists out there, i.e. a godlike being. So the first person that he targets is a guy named John. And we're told John never left the war, right? If you were to ask him about his friends, he'd list the names of dead men, right? He's a coward. He couldn't end it all, but didn't have it in him to move on either. And so Cletus Kasady, quote unquote, grants him the mercy that God would give him by helping him finish with all his living in a pretty brutal way. Following that, he goes after a guy named Thomas. Then he goes after a guy named Matthew, right? And it says, they all die one by one. They all die alone, and no one cares. And then at that point, we switch over to a guy named Philip, right? And we're told that when he was 19, he took a weapon to the local gas station and did a whole bunch of people in, including his ex-girlfriend, and injured 9 folks along the way. And it says he intended to basically die in the process, and that he was going to sacrifice his life to prove that it mattered. But what ends up happening is Cletus appears, and really, unlike the other people that he went after, this is really kind of the first person that sees him almost as a god, because Cletus approaches him in that way, right? Like he asks him, have you found God in here? And this guy says, I was trying to. And Cletus says, then let us pray. And so like they literally sit down together, and Cletus is like, the forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of his grace, amen. He says a prayer with him and then takes the guy out. And so it's one of these things where whether or not it's building a kind of ideology, whether it is something akin to people who happen to hear this, and then once they get in there, they realize this person's dead, we don't fully know, right? Because it's hard to build a religion around people who are dead and can't really preach your gospel. So exactly how this unfolds, I don't entirely know. But one of the things that is important to point out here is that in relation to gods are powered by prayer. It's one of the things that Jason Aaron established in his run on Thor, right? That like gods being powered by prayer, especially when it came to Gore the God Butcher, a god that no one prays to is a god who's powerless and easily defeated. And so seemingly, even if Cletus Kasady is taking all these guys out, the very fact that they believe in him seemingly bolsters his power even further. At least that's the conclusion that I would draw here. And so what he ends up doing is going after this guy named Nathaniel, who's basically just like this giant tech mogul. But he kind of taunts him, right? He says like, don't you know me? Do not fear, for I am with you, right? He's just kind of quoting gospel here, right? Passing himself off as a sort of God. And where Nathaniel doesn't necessarily understand what's happening, the response of Cletus is, you know, we all think we're special. It is a staple of Western society. The only way to bear it, right? Thinking you're special, thinking that you might make it. And it's one of these kind of social criticisms to a degree, right? Philosophically, there's all kinds of roads you can go down here, right? This kind of argument that with Western society existing the way that it is, you, I, everybody else, the only way we can really make it in the world is by thinking that there's just something unique about us that will sort of give us the edge over everybody else. Even if it's not true, right? Lacking that belief sort of saps your will to live. Again, all kinds of moral and philosophical arguments to be made there. And he says, but you are special, not because you are. If anything, all the wealth and fame and all of this is the best that you can do, right? You're nothing but a missed opportunity in a $12,000 suit. He says, no, you are special because the world believes you're special. And sometimes belief is all that matters. And that's really an important sticking point here, right? Like the world believes you're special, therefore you're special. There's nothing out there that makes you special, right? It's not as though you have the ability to fly. It's not like you can alter reality. It's not like you're an angel that fell from heaven and landed on earth and the whole world accepts it as an absolute truth. The reality here is that you are special just for no other reason than the fact that people believe you are. For whatever reason, you've convinced them that that's true. And so what ends up happening here is you get this monologue, right? Where it says, one can say much about human indifference, but when presented with something they do not understand, they rarely think the worst. And so this kind of like cloak, right? This just sheet comes down off this giant box and like Nathaniel's in it, right? It's got these little holes in the bottom and it says, they do not see the horror in front of them for what it is. They wonder what he is selling today, what publicity stunt the tech billionaire is up to this time, because from their perception, it's what this guy does. So they're just kind of basing their decision-making and their observations on what they already know about him, right? And then what we end up getting is this statement, it is a painful death in progress before anyone understands what they're looking at. As water turns to blood, the boiling liquid dissolves his skin. So literally this guy is cooking alive, right? As the water's coming in, just boiling water is filling up this tank. And it says they do not understand that they are watching worship, streamed and documented scripture in the making. And so it's this really, really cool moment because what Cletus is doing here is building up this profile. And if you notice on his chest, it's number 12. And that's the important thing here, because with each one of these people that he's taken out, he's put a number on their chest. And so what will happen is likely the news will get a hold of it. They'll give him some kind of arbitrary name, but people will start to realize there is this enigmatic, omnipresent force that's going out there, and no one is untouchable. From a prison inmate behind locked doors to a guy who was inside his home that fought in a war that if anything should be able to protect himself and couldn't, to a tech billionaire with all the money and all the resources in the world, right? Like it's one of these things where it strips all of that away, right? Like with this guy Nathaniel, for example, where were all his billions to protect him from Carnage, right? What was his fame doing to protect him? It was all intangible. It was all things that just kind of exist out there in the ether. And that's the point that Carnage was making. You are special because people believe you're special, which means now if you are dead, people will believe you're untouchable, and they'll believe whatever touched you must be some vastly powerful thing to touch an untouchable man. So it's just one of these really, really cool elements with his character, because as that happens, of course, Flash Thompson kind of transforms into his anti-venom suit to basically go after, because he realizes this is Carnage, right? Carnage has returned in some capacity, and Carnage is the one doing all of this. But for all the people watching it and all the people observing it, it's one of these things where they're like, God, this is mind-blowing, this is crazy. But from Flash's perspective, right? Flash knows what he is looking at. It is an announcement, an invitation it is Carnage. It is Cletus Cassidy welcoming us to church. The game has changed, ladies and gentlemen, and this is one of the coolest Carnage stories that I think I've ever read. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. If you need to get caught up on Carnage, make sure you click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.